Thank you very much. It's an honor to join you today as we discuss what really is one of the most pressing human rights crises in the world. And I want to thank our hosts for their kind hospitality, the Hanns-Seidel Foundation, Ambassador Young-Ho Kim has worked tirelessly to advance the cause of human rights in North Korea. He continues to be a professor even while he's doing this. And I especially want to commend the North Korea Database Center and the Human Rights Archive. I've met a number of your people today, and every time I meet somebody from the archive, I say what you're doing is extremely important. It's important both in the question of accountability, which has come up a number of times today, but it's also important to understand, as Director Ewan will describe after me, to understand the scope and the scale and the patterns of abuses in North Korea. My wife actually is a historian at the same university where I teach. She's a Soviet historian. She works on the Gulag, and particularly on the Stalin period. And she's been working on a book now for a number of years, trying to piece together, using a number of different Russian archives, exactly what was happening in the Gulag. She's looking at questions of public health and sort of treatment of the body and people in the Gulag. And she says not only does the material from North Korea sound very familiar to her, a Stalin scholar, but just the fact that we have today the archive collecting information, collecting these contemporaneous, and this is very important, these contemporaneous testimonies from people, is a huge sort of boon to understanding the repression of the North Korean regime. That this isn't something that 30 years from now we'll have to piece it together, but it's something that we're understanding now because of the work that the archive is doing. I just want to say a few things about the international human rights regime generally and sort of how it works in the sense of and try to get at these questions about how the regime shapes the behavior and even the policies of countries. You know, does it affect leaders and rulers in various countries? But before I do that, I just want to say a word or two about human rights itself. I mean, just the fact that we're here today talking about human rights, this is one of the great sort of moral languages of world politics. This is something that has really come about since the end of World War II. It represents the world of human rights and the idea of human rights. Really represents a kind of a tectonic shift, if you will, in the world of international relations. The late Louis Henkin, who was an international law professor at Columbia University for many years, called human rights, quote, the idea of our time. And I think that's as true today as it has been for decades. And really the caretaker of the idea of human rights is the international human rights regime. And by this, I mean this sort of dense web of declarations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, covenants, treaties, international and regional institutions, state laws, that is, countries' own human rights laws and institutions, as well as this extraordinary constellation of local and global NGOs, advocacy groups, and other private and civil society organizations. So when we talk about the human rights regime, broadly speaking, we can divide this into two closely related fields. First, and this is the way that we mostly talk about the human rights regime, is this idea of a kind of formal legal regime. We talk about the International Criminal Court or tribunals and so on, and that's the kind of legal side. But there's also a more informal, kind of normative or even moral side to this world of human rights. Now, the legal regime is focused largely on the question of accountability, either through criminal trials, through tribunals, in some cases through truth commissions, and no one has mentioned that possibility today, but a truth commission is about sort of accountability in a slightly different way, a kind of truth-telling and letting the truth come out. And in places like South Africa, as you know, this has worked reasonably well, I would say. But when we talk about the legal regime, this has been described as, over the past decades, as a kind of justice cascade. And the political scientists, sort of looking at the evidence, say that there are a couple of big things that we can say about this kind of legal side of human rights accountability. And the first is that holding leaders legally responsible for their actions tends to strengthen the chances for a successful transition to democracy. That simply, sweeping things under the rug tends not to be the best way forward. So that's one thing to say. It's about democratization. Second is, just as these kinds of human rights prosecutions become the international norm, that violators are going to be left with fewer places to hide. There was a time when baby Doc Duvalier in Haiti could sort of go off into exile and live in, I think it was in Monaco or somewhere in the south of France. That's really not the case today. Today, there's no place that would accept some of these atrocious leaders, and that has to do with the kind of expansion of this regime of accountability. Now, when we talk about the sort of legal side, the one thing that's harder to know is the deterrent effect of having these kinds of institutions and tribunals and to have this in place. It's hard to get into the mind of political actors. Are they thinking about the future? Are they thinking about how does deterrence work? And so we can't really know this, but I think we can say that if you don't have, in this case, if the COI did not go forward, if there were some obstacles to accountability, that if you didn't have those things, that certainly this would seem to the abuser and the violator of human rights, this would seem to be an invitation to just carry on the status quo. And so I think, that's obviously not an option today. And so I think I think most people in the academic world and certainly in the international legal world welcome these kinds of commissions of inquiry. And honestly, if the United Nations Human Rights Council, which has had its troubles over the years, if they can't do a COI in the case of North Korea, I would ask you, when could they ever do it? This is, as I said, it's one of the most pressing crises in the world. So that's all in the kind of the legal side of the regime. But I also want to say that I think equally important is the normative side of the human rights regime. The truth is, human rights shape much of the kind of normative or moral discourse in world politics today. These are kinds of questions, not empirical questions about how does the world work, but more questions of how should it work, or what should the world politics look like. And the language and the assumptions of human rights are very much ingrained now in us. They're ingrained in international organizations. And so that language and those assumptions, they find their way into the media, they find their way into public opinion, and ultimately, we hope, they find their way into the minds and behavior of political actors. But at the end of the day, human rights is really about the victims. And so what human rights does, and I'll talk about sort of how it does this, but what it really does is to shift our attention to the victims themselves. Not so much the perpetrators of these crimes, but the victims of the crimes. And human rights become sort of benchmarks or measures for the treatment of people. Now, when we talk about human rights, obviously, and we've heard this from a number of speakers today, but obviously human rights is a political process. It's not, and I think this is important, human rights is not just a sort of abstract idea that we all look up to in the sky and there it is. It's not that. It's a political process, but I mean that in the best sense of the word. Human rights provide an organizing idea, that is, we can coalesce in our thinking around human rights. It provides a sort of moral language, and it provides also a legal strategy. So all of this comes together. These are all sort of political in some sense. And human rights also has an army of activists, that is, of NGOs and others, to kind of press the case and to really push these issues at times when maybe people in political power, it may be inconvenient, it may not be at the top of their agenda. Nonetheless, we have NGOs and other activists sort of making this the case. I think we can say safely that human rights is one of the most kind of networked NGO'd ideas in history, and it's often held out as sort of the kind of model global social movement around this idea of human rights. Now, there are a couple of big things I want to say about rights. Is what really distinguishes human rights and human rights sort of discourse, that is, talking about rights and the language that we use, is that rights are notable for their descriptive depth and for their detail. It's not just sort of, again, abstract language. And so I think we have to keep in mind the details of rights. It's certainly appropriate to say that North Korea is a totalitarian regime. I don't think there's any argument to be made about that. But it's not enough to simply say this is a totalitarian regime. Rather, you have to specify. You need in detail, in specifics, you have to describe how government totally controls people's lives. That's what totalitarian states do. And human rights language and the details of human rights help us to do that. Human rights are superb for sort of describing these kinds of details. Violations of human rights are tangible. You can touch them. They're concrete. They're things that you can point to. You can make lists of the abuses that are happening. Lives extinguished. Speech curbed. Movement curtailed. Education denied. Innocent people arrested or detained. Human rights sort of drill down they bore into the details of life. And it's those details, I think, that make human rights an issue. Much of the strength of what the archive and the database do is the personal side of these narratives. Even this morning, the Japanese ambassador talking about the 13 or 14-year-old girl who was abducted. This is about humanizing these stories. It's about telling a story that has a very human element that we can appreciate. And so, it comes out in the details. We hear a story, we hear a narrative. Human rights researchers may generate a story. Amnesty and Human Rights Watch often use these kind of first-person narratives about their experiences because it's very compelling and it captures our attention, but it also it instills a kind of empathy in us. And so you hear those stories. A journalist catches the story. A website springs up. And ultimately it builds or snowballs into the kind of full-fledged, in the case of North Korea, the kind of full-fledged investigation such as the Commission of Inquiry. So I think this is one sort of big thing you could say about human rights. Something specific about the North Korean case is that I think that that what's happening now, that there's a shift in sort of the way that people are starting to think about the North Korean issue. Obviously, the nuclear weapons question isn't going away, but I do think that the Commission of Inquiry, and even what we're doing here today, in some ways represents a shift from thinking predominantly in terms of regional security to thinking also and highlighting as well, or spotlighting human rights. And I would say that process, this new way of thinking about North Korea, is still in its infancy. Just to give one example, I did a quick search of the New York Times archive. Since 1980, the New York Times has done 5 times as many stories on North Korea and nuclear weapons or nuclear issues than it has on North Korea and human rights. Because to an international audience, often it's the nuclear question that seems much more pressing and important. This is not to say that regional security is not important. I think you could even make an argument that the people of South Korea or the people of Japan have a human right not to live with the possibility of these weapons sort of looming over their heads. But I do think that talking about rights and focusing on, again, on these sort of details of human rights really directs our attention to the people who suffer most. And that is the people of North Korea. Okay? Another point I wanted to make is just about the new sort of media environment and what this may mean in the case of North Korea. Certainly, the human rights movement has gathered momentum in the media age. Talk to any sort of human rights NGO, they're very savvy about uses of media, about using YouTube and other measures. In the case of North Korea, we know about that outside information is increasingly getting into North Korea. I heard an interview the other day with Eric Schmidt from Google, who was, as you know, probably was in North Korea briefly. He estimated that there were about 1 million cell phones in North Korea, but as he said, the data signal is blocked. So, in some ways, the possibilities are almost endless for information to flow into North Korea. So this is how we usually think about it. But at the same time, obviously this is an issue, if you live in the Republic of Korea, you always hear about this. But in other parts of the world, we're learning much more about North Korea. And so information is flowing in different directions. You can go to Google Earth and see pictures of basically gulags in North Korea. And I think that we can expect even greater momentum for human rights in North Korea as more details and more, especially sort of visual details, emerge from North Korea. And we do know from experience that public opinion can pivot on a seminal photograph. That is a particular visual image, think about Abu Ghraib. I mean, there are certain images there that are inscribed in our minds. And so we do know that that's the case. If you go back into the wars in Yugoslavia, there were a couple of in particular, some imagery. The British TV news ITN had some images of these Bosnian prisoners being held behind barbed wire. It looked like the Holocaust. And that image, more than anything else, that image it pivoted public opinion in my country, and it made what was happening in the Balkans into an issue. Now, I think we can say that viral moment has not come yet in the case of North Korea, but certainly awareness is growing by the day. Several people today have talked about books that are coming out for defector stories and so on. There are a number of films that are being released even in the U.S. There's a new film by Ann Shin called The Defector, which is coming out anytime now. There's a more kind of informal It's basically a YouTube film, but pretty sophisticated, done by Vice Travel. I don't know if you've seen this, but not to mention a book, a novel about North Korea just won the Pulitzer Prize. You know, this is important because it changes the sort of the landscape and the details and the way that people think. One thing, though, I would say about many of the movies that come out, or especially movies that are made by people who did get a visa and did manage to get into North Korea, they end up, for example, the Vice Travel film ends up being about the sort of the weirdness of North Korea and the weirdness of the regime, but what it doesn't do is to tell the stories of everyday life, because film crews who are allowed into North Korea are basically not allowed to talk to ordinary people. And so you end up with a kind of, again, sort of a strange, in some ways perhaps distorted vision. It's this pictures, we know it's a Potemkin village, but nonetheless that's all they have to show, and so that's what we see. So I think it's important to think about how increasing our knowledge about North Korea is changing the landscape of the discussion about human rights in the country. So I want to close just by saying, with a few comments about challenges facing the Commission of Inquiry, because there are many. We've heard about a number of them already today. One thing I would say, and this is much of my own research has been related more to the European human rights regime. As a rule, when we talk about human rights regimes, the closer the venue, the better. That is, it's probably better for these things to be handled in regional venues. The European regime obviously is it stretches, Russia as a member, so it stretches all the way across Russia. But in these regional regimes, the inter-American regime as well, tend to be some of the most robust international regimes. Whereas the UN process, as we know, can be somewhat unwieldy. Certainly that has been the case in the past. So that's one issue. Another relates to this question of accountability. It's going to be what the COI will have to sort of define for itself. What does it mean by accountability? Does it mean we focus on top leaders, the top echelon of leaders? What about functionaries who are carrying out orders? What do we mean exactly by accountability? And I think that's something that the inquiry is going to have to deal with. Another sort of big question, and again, I don't have the answer, but is to think about how do you translate the sort of the reputational costs of the COI. That is the cost to the North Korean reputation. Several people I talked to today have noted that North Korea is intensely interested in and worried and nervous about its portrayal and its image overseas. I'm no psychologist, but I do think that if Kim Jong-un is as vain as he appears to be, then clearly he's very sensitive to world opinion. So that's going to be a very interesting question. It's not just what does the COI report say, but really how does this translate into the way that North Korean, the regime sort of sees itself. Another question is related to this term, crimes against humanity. I think the term is utterly appropriate to use in this case, but I also think it's important always when we talk about crimes against humanity to then follow up and say, by crimes against humanity, that itself is a fairly abstract term, but it's a legal term that has specific meaning, and to remind the world when we talk about crimes against humanity that we're talking about specific things. If we use the International Criminal Court definition, there are abuses that are widespread, they're systematic, and they can cover any number of things, but certainly torture, murder, disappearances, the labor camps themselves, possibly even the political manipulation of food, that is a sort of politically induced famine. because I think all of these, again, it goes back to the sort of the power of details. So when we talk about crimes against humanity, what specifically do we mean by crimes against humanity? And finally, I would just say that, you know, we've heard a lot today about dialogue, about starting a conversation. And I think this is, I mean, in some ways, this will be the most interesting thing about the COI, is not sort of, yes, what it says will be important. The Human Rights Council has, as I said earlier, has had its troubles, but this is a particular case on which it has a great deal of legitimacy, that there were no sort of political roadblocks to it moving forward. But in some ways, it's going to be very interesting to see what happens after this. What is the North Korean response? And I think hopefully it will be the beginnings of, you know, I know already there are a number of back channels and not so back channels of dialogue, but it's this trick of, you know, how do you draw the North Korean regime into a conversation about rights? You know, China, for a number of years now, has been publishing their sort of white papers on human rights, making arguments that are in some ways contrary to the sort of